Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11, WCTV Channel 21, and streaming on Facebook Live. This program is also available to be seen on CTV3 in Connorsville. My name is Eric Marsh. I'm Executive Director of Whitewater Community Television. Glad you're able to join us for this week's Ask the Doctors with, I don't know, they were, who's first? With Dr. David Jetmore. See, I was actually somewhat listening. Wayne County Public Health Officer, Dr. Thomas Huth, Vice President of Medical Affairs for Reed Health. Gentlemen, once again, thank you all very much for being here, so taking the time out of your schedule to join us.
Good to be here, Eric.
We're going to, before we get into some new topics this week, or somewhat new topics, I'm not sure if there are any new ones, want to get into a couple of the questions that we didn't get to answer last week. We still went off the air. We were kind of getting a couple of questions still in. So I want to try to get those answered on the front side. So let's start with the first one up. Are we prepared in Wayne County to meet the core state preparedness guidelines as stated in the President's guidelines for opening up America again? And this goes on a little bit to go into a couple of specific things. And I'm not even going to try to read all of that. You all are doctors. Tell us what we're seeing. So obviously, we've talked about being able to set up and effectively test and screen people. Contact tracing is something that has been talked about a lot in national news this past week. So as you read that, one of you go, because I'm not the doctor.
Well, at this point in time, we are still encumbered by a lack of ability to test as much as we'd like. We've been plagued in the past with a shortage of reagent. Then that was solved because we were able to send these specimens over in saline. Now I heard this morning that we've had a shortage of the cotton applicators that collect the specimen in the back of the throat. Mm-hmm. And also that the supplies that we order from our supplier here at Reed Hospital, they keep diverting these supplies elsewhere to areas probably like New York City or Detroit, where they have a greater burden of illness. And so we really aren't at the level that we would like to be at in terms of testing. Do you have anything to add, Dr.
I think I agree with that. You know, all those criteria for reopening are maybe not necessarily off on yes, no. They're more like where are we on a scale on each one of those issues. And, you know, we have more testing available or have had, but it's very spotty and, you know, it's not as wide open available as certainly we would like to be is probably the biggest thing. But, you know, the things related to contact tracing, you all have covered. But, you know, as we identify more and more cases, I would imagine that becomes much more challenging to do that tracing and the monitoring for
takes
those.
More, you know, the more tracing you do, the more tests you need, the more manpower you need mm-hmm. to follow up the contacts. It branches out like a tree from that one case that you pick up. Mm-hmm. But the person who posed that question is right. These things need to be put in place to safely get us back to where we were.
So how is the health department doing the contact tracing that you all are talking about? Are there people in your staff that handle that? Are you all going to figure that you'll end up needing to hire a couple of additional people just to handle that? What's the protocol?
Well, a lot of this contact tracing, we'll find out that somebody's tested positive. We'll contact that person, find out all their contacts, where they work, family members, where they live, any contact with neighbors, and then we'll trace down those people, see if they're ill, and try, if there's been a very close association, we may also go ahead and ask those people to self-isolate. The person who does the brunt of this work is Christine Stinson, who's the executive director at the Public Health. And unfortunately, I don't know this gal's name. She's a retired nurse, a retired RN who volunteered her services. And she has done a fantastic job helping Christine out. But as these number of cases, as you said, Eric, grow, we're going to need more and more people, more and more tests. One of the dilemmas is, in my mind, is putting people in a self-isolating is easier said than done. Go home and self-isolate. Well, if you are able to live in your basement like the reporter Cuomo, is it Chris? Mm-hmm. And but what if you're living in a house trailer with 5 kids and your wife? How does that person effectively isolate? The Chinese solved this by just taking everybody away from their family in kind of a draconian fashion and isolating all those people in a gymnasium with cots or however they did it. Mm-hmm. But on the optimistic side of this, I've not seen anyone who self-isolated that infected a family member that I'm aware about. That may have happened, I'm just not aware. So it's worked out so far.
One of the other conversations has been, as this maybe leaves us a little bit this summer and comes back again this fall, and there seems to be a thought that it will. It looks so much like the flu. What's the plan or what's the thought for being able to, in the future, separate whether somebody just truly does have the flu versus whether someone has COVID? And what do you test for first?
Well, we already have rapid tests for influenza, and we'll certainly be doing those. And I'm hopeful, fingers crossed, that by fall we're going to have more rapidly available testing for COVID on a more plentiful basis. And so my thought is, we'll probably, hopefully by then, be able to easily test people for both at the same time and know what we're dealing with. It's not always either they've got flu or they have COVID. We are aware of situations where people have been infected with both at the same time. It's not really common, but we will probably have to take a dual testing approach to be able to definitively know what we're dealing with. Obviously, if you have both COVID and flu, you're going to be treated for the flu, and whatever treatments by then are available for the COVID-19.
Well, we have flu vaccinations for the ordinary flu that we see every winter, so people really need to get those flu shots because, that at least you can eliminate one disease. It's going to be even harder on you if you have both the flu and COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Got a couple of questions that we still want to get to before we get pulled off the subject, so next one up. For those who have come to the respiratory clinic and have been told that they likely have the virus, how long are their immediate family members at risk of being sick or spreading it? This is somewhat what we talked about. I know some employees who are being told they must be fever and symptom-free for 3 days before returning to work. You all talked a little bit about this last week, what some of the guidelines are for people being able to go back to work. Would you like to go back over that and see whether it covers everything within this?
Well, I can tell you that for folks who come through the respiratory clinic that are identified as higher risk for COVID, that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be tested. But we're treating them all as though they have, and they're being given advice about isolation and self-management and so forth. Now, they are also all being reported, as we are required to do, to the health department, and so contact tracing and more information comes from the health department for them, and at least in some cases. And so I'm not in a great position to say what other family members should do, but in my mind, sort of ideally, other people in the household would isolate as much as possible as well. But it gets back to Dr. Jetmore's point about, maybe that's not practical on every situation. So there has to be a good deal of common sense applied, but we do have systems in place to help people to keep in touch with them. We have some nurses who do that for some of the respiratory clinic patients, and some of those folks are alternatively followed by the health department so that they're symptom checking, getting advice, and so forth. So, I think otherwise that's as much as I can do from my vantage point, but the health department may have other standards that they're applying for that.
No, I think you pretty well summarized the approach.
You're watching Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11, WCTV Channel 21, streaming on Facebook Live. Next question that we go to. Do we have a number of how many people that didn't meet the rules for testing that were told to go home and quarantine themselves for 14 days? Do we know how many people that didn't meet the rules for testing that were told to go home and quarantine for 14 days? How many of those people could actually have COVID and are not being counted in the number of cases for our county? This, I think, covers a couple of things. One is, how are these numbers being reported? What you're seeing and who's telling who what. What are you all telling the health department? What's the health department telling the state about the numbers that are actually here?
Well, the numbers the rules about reporting have changed, particularly in the last week, and so we are now giving information to the health department for reporting to the state on the probables by clinical criteria. As I say, they're not all being tested. Not that we don't want to test them, it's just that we don't have enough testing capability to test everybody at this point. And so the state has recognized this, and they're taking our information on people who probably have COVID according to clinical criteria. And so those are getting into the process now where maybe they hadn't been in the past. And so, you know, that's something that's new and changed. And so to the point of how much of these numbers are getting into the state statistics, they are now.
But in the beginning, I think there were a lot of people who obviously, in retrospect, had COVID and were never reported. They weren't part of the official statistics. And one of the things you have to remember, Eric, is that in several studies, the one that comes to mind is Iceland, where they tested 6% of their citizens. 25% of the people who were tested had no symptoms and never did have symptoms. So you could almost add 25% to our numbers across the board.
What's coming out nationally this week is that, particularly in San Francisco, where they went into quarantine and stay at home very early, they're believing that it was in their community even before they thought it was. So that seems to be, we're all behind a little bit with some of the numbers and the belief. Right. We still have a couple more questions that we want to try to get to before we break off into some new information. So what's the next one up? Do you know what the plan is for the inmates affected by COVID-19? And Dr. Jetmore with the health department, I think this is toward you.
The sheriff's department has its own plan, and it's a good one. Every inmate that's brought into the jail is isolated for 2 weeks. All of the inmates, when they're in any kind of a group setting, are given masks, they're given hand sanitizers, and they've got a wing set up with negative air pressure if they have any COVID cases. So far, there's not been a single case at the jail. I think one prisoner was tested, and that test was negative. So that we're ready for that problem should it occur.
We are taking your questions on Facebook. You can also send us a tweet to @WCTV Info. If you have a question for the doctors, Dr. David Jetmore, Wayne County Health Officer, Dr. Thomas Huth, Vice President of Medical Affairs at Reed Health. Questions. I'm glad somebody else is asking them besides me. What's the next one, Ryan? For Dr. Huth, in your opinion, have the ventilators worked better than CPAP or bipap machines? Are you using both?
We are using all modalities. You know, it's interesting, the sort of the thinking on treating patients who are in respiratory failure has evolved over time, like many things have with COVID, evolved very rapidly. Early on, the consensus in the medical community across the country was that patients who are in respiratory failure should go to intubation and mechanical ventilation early. The thought was that those may have done better, but now there's more information coming out that maybe that's not the case. So we have changed our practice in accord with that, and currently the thought is to try to use non-invasive ventilatory support mechanisms like CPAP and such. And so that's what we're certainly doing currently, but we have the capability of doing anything along the whole spectrum, and we're using it all.
Okay, let's keep going. We're just changing off now. You all are so popular, they're sending questions directly to you. Dr. Jetmore, are you aware of any possible COVID-19 deaths from nursing homes?
Yes, there have been 2 in Wayne County. Wayne County's had 3 deaths during the epidemic, and 2 were nursing home patients in this county. I think Dark County, up where Greenville is, has had 12 deaths. And Madison County, where Anderson is, I think they've had 11. So yeah, I am aware of nursing home deaths, and these are the things you fear the most, because you've got a collection of people who are going to be the most likely to be affected by the virus. So we've done our best to make sure that the nursing homes in Wayne County have PPE and distancing, isolation, and I think they've done a good job.
You mentioned that a couple of things have changed over the weeks that we've been doing this. This is week 5 of doing this. Obviously, we didn't start right away, and recommendations, guidelines, thoughts have changed, masks being one of those things. Now we're finding out in New York that a couple of house cats have gotten it. And we had a conversation at one point where we didn't think that this was something that animals could have, but we've got tigers in the zoo, 8 of them, and house cats. Are you finding or hearing of any of that here locally where people are concerned about their pets? Pets are like family to a lot of people.
That's an interesting story, and but it shouldn't surprise us, because if you think about this virus has jumped species. I mean, this virus was in bats. It got into people. Those cats in New York, I think one of them belonged to a patient who tested positive for COVID. The other cat showed up with nobody in the family had COVID. But of interest is the fact that I looked this up earlier in the day. There was a cat reported in Belgium and 2 dogs in China. So apparently dogs have even gotten it in China. But there's no incidence ever of this being transferred from an animal to a human. So I'm going to keep petting my cat, Eric, and I think you should too.
Along with your other menagerie of animals, right?
I remember that conversation when we had it, and we were maybe kind of in a somewhat jocular fashion, kind of saying, hey, don't rule out possible animal component completely. Mm-hmm. But as Dr. Jetmore says, this really shouldn't surprise us too much, because of we know, as you said, we know that it has jumped species, and I think particularly in the SARS epidemic, the original SARS epidemic in 2003, there was I think what they finally determined, that there was a zoonotic reservoir in civet cats in Asia. And so we have a known situation where feline species were involved in the transmission process in one way, shape, or another. And so, yeah, it shouldn't surprise us too much that animals could get these kinds of viruses, because, it has happened. But as Dr. Jetmore says, we know at this point of no situations where humans have gotten the virus from animals. And so I don't know what that means. Is that going to happen in the future? Who knows? But I personally would not worry about my animals if I had one, which I don't at this point.
Question, just kind of a weird little...
Well, you're fascinated by this subject, aren't you, Eric?
No,
whole cat thing.
I don't have any animals, sorry. Is the same test used on animals that is used on humans to find out whether they have this disease?
I would assume, I think the first I heard about cats being involved was when one of the tigers in the Bronx Zoo was sick, and somebody thought to test for COVID, and it was positive. And
one of the zookeepers had been sick.
Okay, maybe that was where it started. Zookeepers were sick, so they tested some animals. And so, we don't know, who had it. I guess we can't say for sure who had it first. Probably it was the zookeeper and then the cats. But then, in response to that, some where they inoculated cats and dogs, and I think one other species, but I've forgotten which it is. Might have been ferrets, to see if they could actually induce the animals to get it. They could in the cats, but not in the dogs or ferrets that they tested. And I remember from that report, they said that they did test them with the standard nasal swab or nasopharyngeal swab that we use in humans. But I would think that'd be an uncomfortable thing for the animals. So I'm not sure how, what your process would be. Maybe you have to anesthetize them or something. I don't know.
Well, I would not try to hold down a cat
Right,
and try
exactly.
to stick a probe in
Especially
his
not a
nose.
tiger.
No, not the tiger, surely.
You're watching Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11, WCTV Channel 21, streaming on Facebook Live. Our doctors are Dr. Thomas Huth from Reed Health, Dr. David Jetmore, Wayne County Health Department. Before we move on, the Wayne County Health Department earlier this week altered, relaxed, I guess, based on something that the governor had asked, some of their guidelines, opening up the lobby area of restaurants for a certain number of people. Can you talk about those rules? And based on some of the guidelines that had been talked about before that we were looking at, a downtrend for 14 days, that kind of thing that didn't happen, why were those guidelines relaxed?
Well, the governor, the state had never really shut lobbies down. We had done that. We were more strict than the state. And the governor had also recently relaxed having dog groomers, animal groomers. So in the spirit of that, we brought our restrictions up to the level of where the state was, although I think our restrictions are better. We've asked people going into the lobby or up to a counter to order that less than 10 people be inside and that they be able to space themselves out 6 feet apart. But that's why that was changed.
As we go forward a little bit, another week, and this is almost a week-by-week type of situation, although the governor speaks at 2:30 every day, so things could change a little bit almost every day. Where are some of the next business areas or economic areas that you see potentially being able to be relaxed, even if we're not meeting all of our testing guidelines, not meeting all of our downward trend guidelines for 14 days, things of that nature? And I ask because we got a question earlier on Facebook. Someone asked us to reach out to the governor, which we can't do. So I'm going to ask you locally. Beauticians, barbershops, more hands-on type of places like that.
Well, beauticians, barbershops, that's always problematic because the people are in such close contact with each other. You're within a foot of each other, and so you're not going to get much protection from a mask. So I'm not ready to let that return to normal, to the way we were before the epidemic came. I think one of the things we could explore, if people have a large dining room in a restaurant, of letting, having some dining areas where people can space themselves out. That might be tried. But I'm looking at where we're at right now. It's so disquieting, Eric, not knowing who has this virus, where it's at. And I think what we're doing, we're unscrewing the lid a little bit and then seeing what happens. One of the things the state is doing, I think we're going to do 20,000 tests. These are antibody combined with the actual test of the virus. They're going to do this 5,000 people at a time. They're going to do this at various places around the state. The people will be chosen randomly, and the idea of this is to find out how widespread this virus is, because we've tested such a small amount of our population that how many tests have we done in Indiana? We've got 6.5 million people, and we've tested how many?
I think, I don't know that it's on my charts today, but I'm going to take a wild guess and say around 35,000, something
Yeah,
like
think
that.
of that. We've tested 35,000 citizens, and we have 6.5 million people. So one of the things I'm hopeful that this will do, it'll tell us many things. That antibody test will tell us where has the virus been. There may be people who have developed immunity. We can tell this from the level of immunoglobulin G in their blood. Where has it been? Where has it not been? We can get an idea of how widespread this is. We know we've been able to test the sick people, but all of these people that have probably had the virus even before we started testing, we've undercounted everything simply because of the lack of testing.
Are there other areas that you see you could open up? I know you mentioned dining areas. And what are some of the new normals that each of you all see? Will my server, as I've heard in some restaurants, if you open up some dining areas, will my server have a mask on? Will my server be wearing gloves? Are we going to see face masks as part of a regular piece of this for a period of time going forward? And
I think we
what
will.
are some of the safety zones for people?
It's been my advice and the advice of the health department that anybody, and as I said last week, the one time you breach that 6-foot distance is when money or a credit card changes hands. So when I go to pick up a pizza, I put a mask on and roll my window halfway down. But oftentimes I've recommended that everybody that's dealing with the public at a cash register have a mask on, and gloves would be good as well. But I rarely see this, or I see it maybe 20% of the time. Mm-hmm. And you probably all have had similar experiences when you get food.
Sure. By the way, I've looked it up. It's 75,000, but still, it's not a huge proportion. To your point, I think we at Reed, we're looking to how can we get back to still being what Reed is to the community and all its services, but with COVID in the background. So there is a new normal aspect to this. There's an interesting article published recently in the New Yorker magazine, I think it was, about somebody an American who was in Hong Kong for at the time of the SARS epidemic in the early 2000s. And it's kind of eerily similar to what we're doing now in all its respects. So if that's any way of pointing forward into what the new normal could look like, I would recommend going to read that article. But somehow we will have a new normal, and it's going to be continued distancing and heightened awareness of sanitary practices, and different ways of interacting with people in the familiar environments, whether that's in workplaces or in retail settings. Everything is going to be different, I think, going forward. I don't see us going back to what it was prior to about March the 15th or so, when we really started making a lot of restrictions. I think everybody's too changed, but I don't know exactly what that looks like.
I think we'll see more telemedicine in the future.
Yeah.
I think we'll see more video conferencing in the future. It'll never go back to the way it was. We'll look at those times fondly, or at least I will.
Okay. You mentioned telemedicine as being one of those things that will probably continue to grow. You can't solve everything with telemedicine. One of the conversations this week nationally, and when it gets down to it, we find out we're not that different from what's happening nationally. One of the conversations is there have been people who maybe have been having strokes or heart attacks or some other serious health issues that have been weighing, should I go to the emergency room and what can I pick up versus what I'm actually feeling right now? Talk about whether you all are seeing or hearing of any of that locally, and how do you set people's minds at ease that if they're having an issue that can't be handled over a phone or a tablet, that they show up at your facility. You talked about Reed getting back to what Reed is to the community.
Right. We have noticed a somewhat disturbing trend that volumes in our emergency department are down, which is great. If people aren't sick, that's a good thing. But we're having trouble believing that people aren't actually sick. With the normal routines, the things that we see throughout the year or this time of year. And just a couple of quick anecdotal things that we've seen. A couple of heart attacks where people waited over a day from the start of their symptoms to come in to get evaluated. A couple of strokes, similar circumstances. Time is muscle when it comes to heart attack. Time is brain when it comes to stroke, and those are very, very unfortunate things. They're more extensive damage than there needed to be. And in all those cases, people were hunkered down at home, just kind of hoping things would pass, too afraid to come to the hospital because of the perception that the hospitals are COVID, are basically COVID incubation spaces. And additionally, in our respiratory clinics, we've somebody asked a question before, how many folks do we think are COVID possible? And actually a pretty large proportion coming through our respiratory clinic, about 30%. But the thing I want to point out about the respiratory clinic is that we're actually seeing people getting referred to the respiratory clinic because they meet some thresholds, like maybe fever or some kind of respiratory symptoms. So they come through the respiratory clinic, but in actuality, they have pneumonia that's not COVID related, or they've got exacerbation of their obstructive lung disease, or we've actually identified 4 people with appendicitis.
Wow.
3 of whom were perforated.
Wow.
And in each of those cases, they've all in all those peripheral things not related to COVID, they've all waited a long time to call in and say, I'm having these symptoms, what should I do? And basically having 75% of your appendicitis cases already be perforated is kind of unheard of in today's day and time. And of course, that's a much more complicated surgery, much higher likelihood of complications. So I think the way our society, the government, our society, our messaging has now very effectively, encouraged people to stay home and not go out into the public. But we've kind of inadvertently created the impression that it's not safe to be at a hospital for anything these days. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We've spent the last 5 or 6 weeks really changing our processes, our structure, and our assessment capabilities to very effectively make sure that people who possibly have COVID are managed effectively through one system, and everybody else is managed effectively through another. In effect, we've got 2 systems set up in the hospital now. So, I feel much safer being in the hospital environment than any place else out in the community, with the possible exception of your studio, Eric.
Well, thanks.
Because we are appropriately distanced and using proper technique here. But point is, I like to apply the grocery store measure, which is something that I need to do. Should I be worried about doing that thing? Well, am I safer doing that, or am I safer going to the grocery store? You are way safer coming to the healthcare system for evaluation and management than you are going to the grocery store as it stands today. Way safer. So we need to get people to understand that they shouldn't neglect their health problems. There may be some routine type health procedures that we're still delaying and prioritizing, but when people are actually sick and need help, they should never hesitate to reach out, because we can take care of them very effectively and safely. I'm personally very comfortable with that. If I get sick and have a heart attack, I know what to do, and I'm not afraid at all. And I don't think anybody else should be.
You're watching Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11. Dr. David Jetmore, Wayne County Health Department, Dr. Thomas Huth, who's going to pay a lot more for his groceries next time he goes to do some shopping here.
I'll be wearing my mask so they won't recognize me.
From Reed, Vice President of Medical Affairs at Reed Health. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't. What are some of the first steps Wayne County would take to begin reopening May 1, assuming Governor Holcomb is able to do so? This is going to be a question that we're going to tackle. I mean, we're a week away from kind of that next deadline, and people are going to be looking for a little breathing room.
Well, I think we're going to move in this instance in opening up. I think we've been more strict than the state and earlier than the state. But I think we're going to move with the state on opening things back up. Now, I don't expect the governor, and no one knows what the governor is going to do. He may not even know at this point, because what you do today is what you do tomorrow is dictated by what happened today. But I'm going to move the county along with the state. Whatever the governor opens up, I'll open up. But I don't know how he'll proceed. I'm sure he'll be advised by Dr. Box and the epidemiologist for the state. But whatever the governor opens up, I'm going to open up.
In the exact same way, or will you modify maybe a little bit if you think it's better for the residents of Wayne County? Because you did just say you went a little stricter and you went with some things earlier even than the state. So are you going to continue that hesitation?
Yes. That's my tendency, Eric. I feel a responsibility to the people in the county, and that may not make me the most popular person at times, but I'm very happy with where we are at this point compared to all the surrounding counties. And I don't want to surrender this high ground that we've gained here. I don't want to unleash anything. I think everywhere where they're opening up, everybody's looking at some of the states that are opening earlier, like Georgia, what will happen? Mm-hmm. We've seen cautionary tales in other countries. In Singapore and Japan, they basically said, let's go back to what we were doing, and now they're having secondary outbreaks. Numbers are climbing again. So we don't want to make those same mistakes. But if I do err, it'll be on the conservative side.
Next question up. We done? No. I think this one we just did. What do schools look like for the fall? That's a crystal ball type of question, so I'll let you all take your.
Well, I think we can both talk about this. I think it's going to depend on what develops this summer. I think it's going to depend a lot on testing and what we find out about our population. Go ahead, Tom.
It's purely speculative. So, I think, I would use the analogy of the last 5 weeks have been a real learning opportunity for us in healthcare, and some things are going to be done very differently going forward than they used to be done in the past, and they're going to be done very effectively because we've now experimented with different technological ways to interact with people. It doesn't replace everything. I wouldn't be surprised if schools don't also have the same learning or experience, and that when schools are back in, we'll have some combination of face-to-face learning, online learning, more technologically enhanced ways that help to preserve the distancing and so forth. So that's an area where I will bet. I mean, I'm not an educator. I don't really know anybody who's an administrator in education enough to have this kind of conversation, but I would bet that they're thinking about these things, and we'll see education be a significantly different experience going forward.
Smaller class sizes, things of that nature, more than likely. The social distancing will, I assume, be one of those things that until there's a vaccine or more known, you all as healthcare professionals are going to continue to push? Question mark.
Are we going to continue to push social distancing?
Yes.
Yeah, it's our only tool really at this point. We don't have a single medicine that's been shown effective at this point in treating the disease. So the only real tool we have is to try to prevent the disease.
That'll be interesting for football season. How do you keep those crowds down? How do you distance those crowds?
For professional sports, it may come down to watching two teams play in an empty stadium.
They've talked about that for baseball, potentially. I think they've tried it in one or two countries. Golf is going to pick up, I think, here in June. And the first match is not supposed to have any fans. It'll just be the golfers. Golfers are happy with you this week, I guess, where they weren't maybe a couple of weeks ago. They beat you into submission. They promised to pay your greens fees. What's the deal? 2 weeks ago, you were pulling them off the
You remember that
course.
scene from the movie where the villagers are storming the castle? They're carrying pitchforks and those torches. Well, imagine the horror if those were all golfers. They've all got 9 irons in their hands and swinging golf bags. That's a terrifying thought, so I acquiesce to the golfers. Hopefully they're not crowding around each other at the greens.
The 9th hole, or the 19th hole, right?
Yeah.
Dr. Huth, you were able to provide us with some statistics, and I know people are interested in the numbers of tests, the numbers of people, what this looks like, and you were able to provide us with some numbers. Indiana and locally, and I'm wondering if you can go through a couple of those.
Sure.
We've got a couple of questions I think we need to hit, but Indiana County distributions, positive COVID-19 cases. Talk a little bit about what you're able to show us as those slides come up.
Well, so what we've done here is, and I need to give a big shout out to my young colleague Patrick Ripberger at Reed, who is kind of a whiz with these data visualizations. And so thank you, Patrick. Basically what he's done is he's pulled off the state website, in this first graphic, the positive cases by county and sort of highlighted by intensity. And of course, as we all know, Marion County has the most cases, and Lake County's kind of a distant second. But on the right side, if you adjust that on a per capita basis, in this case it's per 10,000 residents, what you can see is actually the big hotspot is Decatur County down there in southeast Indiana, which is down to the lower left of the quadrant of the state, and that's Greensburg. Now, I'd say Decatur County's a rural county, but actually on a per capita basis, they have far and away the highest concentration of cases. And then what I would call spillover effects in the surrounding counties there, probably of most interest to us at Reed, because we service that area, is Franklin County at 39 cases per 10,000. They really have suffered quite a bit, had a lot of cases and a number of deaths. And then the farther you get from Franklin County to the north, Wayne County is at 4.4. So we just don't have that many cases in the county, although we feel like we've tested quite a few people, over 500. But I just wanted to point that out, that some people really aren't aware that what I would call the I-74 corridor from the Indianapolis metropolitan area down towards Cincinnati are kind of disproportionately affected. And then on the next graphic, which shows the deaths, which is maybe a more important indicator of the severity of the disease, on the left we have the most deaths being concentrated in Marion County as the most populated county in the state. But then when you also correct that for per capita, on the right, you can see that, again, Decatur County sticks out like a huge sore thumb, way ahead of Marion County and others. And again, that I-74 corridor is disproportionately affected on a corrected basis. Now, you could also factor in the number of tests that have been done, and so the next graphic shows that. And on the left, we can see that uncorrected for a population, Marion County has done way, way more testing than virtually any other county. Next to that would be Lake County up near Chicago, but they're a pretty distant second. But here again, when you if you correct for the population densities, then we can see that not only is Marion kind of, at 225 per 10,000 is far and above everybody else, but look at Decatur County, 142. Now, the important thing is here, Decatur County on a population basis is actually the most impacted county, but they're way in the lower half of the availability of testing. And I know that the state is aware of this, and they're doing some things to try to correct that. They have a mobile testing lab going out there several days a week. But the southwest part of the state, kind of in a certain sense, has been disproportionately under-tested for the number of cases that have been identified in that region and by the number of deaths. And I hope that's something that the state will correct here going forward. I know they're aware of it because this comes right from their data, so they have to be aware of it. And they probably have other data behind it that give them ideas. But
Are the more rural areas, are we seeing that in a number of different places that the more rural areas maybe aren't getting? And Dr. Jetmore mentioned some of the tests and swabs and things that they were looking at are being pulled into the urban areas.
Yeah,
are the urban areas kind of taking out the
absolutely.
rural areas in some ways?
I think that the allocations are being made to where the more cases are. I don't think they're being particularly adjusted by population densities, unfortunately, so far. I think the state is working on that. One other one I wanted to mention to you, Eric, is the next graphic. That is the age distributions. We've got a really nice graphic here that Patrick has prepared for us.
And this kind of goes toward the question of school to a certain extent
Yeah,
when
I
you
guess
start
so.
talking about some of our younger people.
Right. So when we look at the positives by age group at the top of the graphic, and this is from the state's website, so this is all of Indiana, not locally, you can see that the highest bar there is in the 6th decade, or the 50 to 59 age group, where, and then it's kind of a bell-shaped curve around that. But when you compare that to the deaths, which is the lower graphic, you can see that that is highly skewed to the higher age groups. And there have actually now been a couple of deaths under age 30, which is a bit concerning about deaths reaching down into the lower age groups, but still the vast majority of deaths been above, more than 80%. I'm sure it's 90% plus and above age 60, which unfortunately Dr. Jetmar and I are in that age range. So we're not very happy about that, but that's the fact of it. So people have also asked about the gender distribution. Again, this is from the state's website. That's the next graphic, Ryan. And the left-hand side, the orange-red area is men on positive tests. Women are the 54.3%. But when you look by deaths, the men highly outnumber the women, 55 to about 42%. So this mirrors the national data that men seem to have more severe disease and be more likely to die. Then on the racial distributions, on the last graphic here, Ryan, the second last graphic, I should say, the green are white people, and we can see that amongst the positives on the left, that's 49% of the positives, whereas the white population in Indiana is 85%, and the yellow, 16.6%, is the black proportion of positives. That's 16%, whereas blacks are only 9.8% of Indiana's population. And a couple of weeks ago, off camera, we were talking about a perhaps dangerous myth in the black community that somehow blacks are immune to COVID or less likely to have problems, and that's just simply not the case. There is a racial disparity. Unfortunately, it's against the black population in these statistics. And that remains the case when you look at it by deaths on the right. White deaths make up a higher proportion here, but still not up to the 85% in Indiana's population, and blacks are 17% of the deaths. So, the bottom line on this is nobody should think they're safe on account of any particular characteristics of theirs. The only people who are less likely to have severe outcomes are the younger folks without chronic medical conditions. But even they are not immune. The last graphic, Ryan, if you could show that, is reads inpatient trends, and we'd like to be as open as we can with the data that we have according to the privacy rules and so forth. And basically what you see here are the, going back to March the 20th through yesterday, the inpatient totals of people in our COVID containment or isolation areas. And you can see that we had a peak between about April 1st and April the 7th, and since then we had a step down, and we're at a kind of a plateau for about 10 or 11 days. And in the last few days we have stepped down again. So we think that's a good trend that we'd like to see continue. What that means for the future is hard to say. You could certainly imagine a scenario where, as the governor opens up more activities in the state and Dr. Jetmore follows suit and more things are happening in the community, that we might actually have an uptick in cases. We feel ready to take care of that. We hope it doesn't happen, but we're prepared should that be necessary.
Okay. You're watching Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11, WCTV Channel 21, and on Facebook Live. We've got some questions that have come in. We have 7 minutes left to go, actually probably closer to 6 now. So let's try to get through a couple of these very quickly. How can I be tested to see if I've already had COVID or now have antibodies? Are we in a position here in Wayne County to begin doing those type of tests?
Let me address that first, and Dr. Jetmore might have some thoughts of his own. We still have some constraints on testing capability. We'd love to test everybody, and I would love to, and Reed would love it one day when testing is plentiful, be able to provide it to any takers, any askers who would like to have it, and encourage people to get tested and when the testing capability is more plentiful. It isn't today. We still have constraints. We still face, the reallocation of testing capability to more of the hotspots in the country, and in the state being more directed to Indianapolis and some other areas. Having said that, we do know that the state yesterday, I think, announced a partnership with the Fairbanks School of Public Health at IU to actually do random testing around the state. They are coming to Richmond, and we are going to host them on a Reed property at some place. I'm not sure when or exactly where. They are taking random people who've not had COVID and are being invited. So it's not like anybody can walk up. You will be turned away if you walk up and try to get tested. But they are reaching out to a certain number of people in the community to come in and get tested on a random basis as a sampling technique to try to build some statistical data about how prevalent the disease is actively in the community. And they also are doing antibody testing. Dr. Jetmore mentioned this earlier. They're doing both the nasal swab PCR testing for active disease, and they are doing antibody testing to try to understand, how many people are actively infected, how many people have evidence of prior infection, but now have antibodies and have recovered, and then they'll be able to extrapolate to the community or to the population at large from those sampling statistics. I think that's as much as is going to be done at this point. And so for the moment, really the recommendations remain the same. If you're sick, contact the appropriate channels, the Reed hotline or the Reed Health Now app to be evaluated and see if you're a candidate to come to the respiratory clinic, or you'll be checked to see if you're a candidate to be actually tested. And we have to have some standards on that because of the limitations on testing capability, and go through that process and get some advice about whether you are likely to be actively infected and know how to take care of yourself from that point. That's as much as we can do right now.
Okay. probably about 3 minutes, I think, and one more question up. Let's see if we can get to it. Can we be hopeful for large group gatherings such as graduations, fireworks, larger weddings in the next 4 to 8 weeks? What are you, again, kind of a crystal ball type of thing, but let's be...
I don't feel hopeful. I wish that could come to pass. I've got a grandson that would like to go through a graduation ceremony from college. That's already been canceled for his college. Again, this is crystal ball stuff. A lot of it could happen. I mean, we could go out and do some people. The sickness could fall off. We could quit seeing people showing up at the respiratory clinic. The COVID ward would empty out at the hospital over the next 3 to 4 weeks. But I don't think that's likely. And so I think, unfortunately, a lot of these events won't be able to be held. It saddens me to say that.
Before we let you go, just as we are heading into another weekend, the weather's nice. There was a lot of talk on social media last week, a number of people out, particularly at the big box stores. There are people who still don't want to wear gloves, don't want to wear masks as they go out. Is there anything that you can say or want to try to say to encourage the use of those things for the community good? I'll start with you, Dr. Shepard.
Let's not let our guard down. We've come this far. You're not sick. The virus hasn't gone away. You don't know where it is. So take care of yourself. And when you wear that mask, you wash your hands and you wear gloves, not only are you protecting yourself, but you're protecting all your fellow citizens. So let's not let our guard down at this stage of the game.
I agree. We need to be responsible to each other. If I go out to, the hardware store or the grocery store, I am wearing a mask now, and that's less to protect myself because I'm not sure in that circumstance how much protection I get. It's better than nothing, but more it's to protect you. I'm doing it for you, and that's the way all of us need to be approaching this. Is we need to be sensitive to others' sensibilities. I'm not sick, but they don't know that. Somebody in the grocery store next to me, I'm giving them some faith that I'm protecting them when I'm taking those steps. And I think it's the way I look at it, and that's the way everybody else should too.
We've wrapped up another week of Ask the Doctors. Dr. Thomas Huth from Reed Health, Dr. David Jetmore, Wayne County Health Department. Gentlemen, thank you again. We will see you here next week at 2 o'clock, next Friday at 2. I think I got it wrong last week. I know that there were 2 or 3 questions that we did not get to, same as we did this week. We will bring those questions to the fore at the very beginning of the program next week. Join us next Tuesday for another edition of Ask the Doctors on Whitewater Community Television's WGTV Channel 11. Have a good weekend. I wish you well.